Part 1. Backgrounds. Chapter 1. Aristocracy. The fish footman said in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess." An invitation from the Queen to play croquet. The frog footman repeated, in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little. "From the Queen. An invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." Alice in Wonderland. In 1901, Windsor Castle, hallowed by royalty, courtiers, and men-at-arms, echoed to the tread of a score of American multi-millionaires. They composed a delegation of the New York Chamber of Commerce come to felicitate Edward VII, newly crowned King of Great Britain and Ireland, and Emperor of India. The king was curious to see the millionaires, particularly J. Pierpont Morgan and Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was not there, but Morgan was, the uncrowned American money king who had just confirmed his mastery by organizing the United States Steel Corporation, the industrial giant which awed equally the man on the throne and the man in the street, and was now buying British ships to form an international shipping trust. From the king down, according to a contemporary report, all concentrated their attention on Mr. Morgan, and their curiosity was not unmixed with awe. Court officers trembled, humorously but none the less suggestively, as Morgan had been actively buying British art treasures, lest Mr. Morgan should take a fancy to Windsor and buy it. One resenting the American invasion, one British newspaper, suggested Morgan's coronation. Wealthy Americans seeking the accolade of royal recognition, 12, shone and presentation, flocked to the British court. Competing with Britain in this, as in other things, Kaiser Wilhelm II began a campaign to secure Americans for his own court, until the honor of German presentation almost matched the British. Morgan was one of Wilhelm's favorites. The Kaiser dined on Morgan's yacht, the Corsair, decorated him with the Order of the Red Eagle, sent him a marble bust of himself, and once called Morgan my mascot because the only time His Majesty's yacht won in the keel races was when the American financier was aboard. Morgan himself cultivated the regal temper, arrogant, arbitrary, massive, and its accompanying delight in splendor and magnificence, assuming the majesty of Renaissance merchant princes. Among the English clergy, whom he often entertained, Morgan was known as Per Pontifex Maximus, so named by an ironical archbishop. Behind the magnificence and regal temper towered the House of Morgan, dominant financially in the world's mightiest industrial nation. The financial power of a new economic system permitted Morgan to become magnificent, to mingle with kings, and to say in royal strain after meeting Kaiser Wilhelm II, "He pleases me." 5. It was the new aristocracy of money accepting and being accepted by the old aristocracy of blood in a world where aristocracy and money were combining and coming to mean the same thing. An aristocracy may perish, but the aristocratic ideal survives, although American colonization, particularly in New England, was an expression of the revolt against aristocracy. Class and caste distinctions prevailed among the settlers. Each stage of colonial development projected its own aristocracy. The older colonial aristocracy, bent to the storms of the Revolution and Jeffersonian democracy, assumed new forms and pretensions in terms of commercial affluence. By 1850, a panegyrist was crowing. There is no nobility in this country. There is a class of the House of Morgan, aristocracy, princes. The princes of commerce, and such names are good in Asia, Africa, Europe, or in any part of America. This commercial aristocracy, however, yielded to the industrial and financial aristocracy arising after the Civil War out of the onward sweep of capitalist enterprise. Multimillionaires now dominated the scene. Kings of railways, oil, steel, beef, pork, copper, tin, banking, developing the American aristocracy of money. But this aristocracy was apparently tormented by an inferiority complex, in spite of adopting seigneurial manners and trappings. Biting the hand that fed it, the new aristocracy began to consider American money as rather common and not quite distinctive. Amassers of illegitimate millions whose methods would now land them in prison started the sport of buying European titles for their daughters. The sport is still on, although declining and cheapened by the competition of movie stars and Russian emigres. But since only women could marry titles, and the opportunity moreover was limited, the aristocracy of money began to acquire ancestors, minus the prisons and the gallows. It helped socially if one's immediate progenitors were pioneers or uncouth business pirates. That the original American Astor was a peddler and his brother a butcher didn't harmonize with Mrs. William Astor's queenly rule of New York's social elite. So they discovered Astors of seigneurial lineage in the aristocracy of France and Castile. Genealogy went on a spree, seeking and finding the most astonishing lineages. John D. Rockefeller is a descendant of Henry I, King of France, and Calvin Coolidge of Charlemagne. J. Pierpont Morgan, according to one genealogist, descends from David I of Scotland, while another ignores the kingly strain and traces the Morgans to Norman robber barons who received large estates in England after the conquest. This tracing of aristocratic lineage, however, was only a stage in the development of the aristocracy of money, and now, 13. I-4 is largely limited to its genteel fringe, which has more blood than money. Research is democratizing aristocratic descent. Every American family of English origin, it appears, stems from Alfred the Great, William the Conqueror, or Robert Bruce. Moreover, the Morgans and other masters of money can dispense with lineage in favor of the more substantial trappings of aristocracy which money provides, their own aristocracy. Power and being are aristocracy's final justification. The aristocracy of money is supreme, and supremacy reconciles it to its lowly origins in the conquest of a continent by the sweat and blood and agony of ordinary men and women, particularly as origins recede in tradition and become ancestry. Aristocracy conforms to its age, developing its own ideals and trappings, which are more than snobbery. They are the manifestations of class supremacy and authority, ensuring order, security, and stability. Power is aristocracy, and money is the source of power in modern civilization and constitutes its aristocracy. The House of Morgan. Chapter 2. Colonial Origins. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened, and now here I am in the middle of 1L. Alice in Wonderland. Miles Morgan, the American ancestor of the masters of the House of Morgan, arrived in Boston in 1636, accompanied by his brothers John and James. They came, as most immigrants then and now, seeking economic betterment. The grandfather was a Welsh saddler, the family originally of the minor gentry, come upon evil times to one. The New World might mean fortune. Colonial immigrants were plain people, in spite of the aristocratic pretensions of their successful descendants. The underlings of English society, they had least to lose and most to gain from adventuring in the wilderness. Considered rabble by the aristocracy, the settlers were merchants, yeomen, mechanics, indentured servants, and imprisoned debtors, the despicables in a system of privilege, yet destined to create a finer civilization. Colonial immigration was an aspect of the general movement of revolt against aristocracy, of the capitalist transformation of feudalism. The onward sweep of this movement washed the Morgans ashore in New England. John Morgan did not tarry in Boston. He was either a skeptic or too merry, for an old chronicle reports that. Observing the bigotry and persecuting spirit of the godly puntins, he quitted these meek disciples A.I. John Calvin with disgust and indignation, going to more congenial Virginia. John's brothers were of tougher, or more godly, fiber. James settled peacefully in New London. The more adventurous Miles A.C., 16 the House of Morgan, accompanied an expedition under Colonel William Pynchon to build a new settlement in the wilderness. The Pynchon party found the Indians perfectly friendly, and for 30 bought a tract of land which now includes 7 towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The settlement was at Springfield. Although under 21 years of age, Miles Morgan suppressed the fact of his minority in the drawing for house lots, which minors were not privileged to do. This was the first business stroke of the American Morgans. Being a soldierly youngster, Miles built a fortified blockhouse upon his property. Enterprising and acquisitive, he secured grant after grant of land, was elected constable, selectman, member of the committee to grant land, and became one of Springfield's 3 most substantial citizens. 4. Miles Morgan thrived exceedingly in Springfield, married twice, had 9 children, and died at the patriarchal age of 84 or 8. But before his death, he took part in King Philip's War, becoming a captain in the colonial militia. Friendly relations between Indians and settlers in New England did not last long. At first buying their land, the settlers simply took it as they became stronger. They would pick a quarrel with the Indians, declare war, and seize coveted lands. The courts assumed jurisdiction over the Indians even when they did not live in the settlements, and ordered Indians fined or whipped for profaning the Sabbath by hunting, fishing, or other misdemeanors, the fines being usually paid in land. 8. The inconvenient questioning of the settlers' land titles brought Roger Williams into conflict with the governing oligarchy and his banishment from Massachusetts. Overmastered and expropriated, the Indians in 1675 flared up in general revolt. King Philip's War was a war of extermination in which the savagery of the Indians was matched by the savagery of the settlers. The Indians attacked, sacked, and burned Springfield, the survivors taking refuge in Miles Morgan's blockhouse, and colonial origins, under his command, beat back all attacks. It was a hopeless situation, however, unless reinforcements came, and the survivors would have been exterminated if a friendly Indian had not crept through the besieging lines and brought aid. 7. A statue in Springfield honors Morgan's services, but not the Indians. Captain Miles Morgan served throughout the war, as did 3 of his sons, of whom an old chronicle reports that they are said to have been perfect Nimrods at the laudable business of Indian hunting. Business was not neglected during the war. 2 weeks after its start, a Boston gentleman proudly announced in a letter that the land already gained is worth 10 pounds. 0000. The Connecticut Council gave soldiers, in addition to regular pay, all such plunder as they shall seize, both of persons and corn or other estate, to be disposed of by them in the way of sale, so as they may best advantage themselves, providing authority shall have the first tender of theer dispose of captives, allowing them the market price to be divided amongst them, to the private soldiers, each man alike, and to the commander so much a better part as there is difference in their wages. 10. The offer of all such plunder as they shall seize, both of persons and estate, apparently inflamed some soldiers to plunder friends and foes alike. As the council subsequently decreed that if so it shall appear that wampum and other goods that was taken as plunder, yet is said to belong to innocent persons not enemies, it ought to be restored. For we may not allow wrongdoing nor disorder in the pursuit of our just revenge. 11. Urged by the Connecticut Council to encourage volunteers as we do, who do grant them all plunder and soldiers' pay, the Massachusetts Council, in declaring unprovoked war upon the Narragansetts, offered its soldiers allotments of land seized from the Indians in addition to regular pay. Indian volunteers and the colonial militia, however, were not granted land for their services during the war. 1. 17. 18. The House of Morgan. Immense tracts of land were seized and divided as spoils. Connecticut granted land to 180 volunteers, among them James and Joseph Morgan. After the war, Miles Morgan and 3 others received all the swamp against their Meadow over Agawam River, viz. The upper Meadow there. 14. In addition to land seizures. Hundreds of Indian captives were sold as slaves in the West Indies and others retained as servants by the settlers. Among the sales were 13 squaws and papooses, 1 sick for 20 pounds, 1 woman, 4 little children for 5, and 41 captives for Z 82.1. The Morgans apparently did not participate in this slave traffic, all of which was considered legitimate. The Puritans identified self-interest in religion, ascribing a godly origin to their actions and the consequences. Instead of realizing that King Philip's war might have been caused by their oppressive behavior toward the Indians, the arrogant clergy, the governing power, insisted in a long proclamation that God had let loose the war because of his displeasure at too much drinking among the settlers, their laxity in persecuting the Quakers, impatience in listening to sermons, women's immodesty in dress, and scores of similar sins. Moreover, dominant Puritanism justified the acquisitive pecuniary vices inspired by the Calvinist doctrines sanctifying business enterprise and accumulation, in contrast to aristocracy. God was manifest in good works, and good works meant labor and property. Property being the manifestation of God's will and blessing, its acquisition was an ideal. The New England settlers interpreted Puritanism in terms of their immediate environment. Land was the most important form of property, one of the gods of New England, and it was doing God's work to expropriate the Indians of their land, the Indians being children of the devil. The Morgans, in acquiring their original stake, were serving God according to their lights and their interests. But there were other than pecuniary ideals in Puritanism. 1. Miles Morgan. Colonial origins Greater Thanine, forged in the revolt against the old feudal order, and formulating ideals of individual and social freedom. The Puritan movement was fundamentally progressive in spite of the limitations imposed upon it by theology and the requirements of developing capitalism, of which it was an ideological expression. There were many radical Puritan sects which broke through the limitations and proposed drastic reforms in equalitarian democracy, expressing the aspirations of common men and women. These sects thrived upon a contradiction in the new creed, since being poor or rich were equally manifestations of God's will, and intolerant contempt of the poor was bred among the rich. But a Puritan might be godly and still unsuccessful in acquiring property. What then? This was unimportant in the early settlements where conditions were primitive, land abundant, measurable equality prevailed, and the clerical aristocracy ruled ruthlessly in God's name. But conditions changed. By 1680, there were already 30 Massachusetts merchants, each worth between $50,000 and $100,000. And by 1700s, there was a definite cleavage between rich and poor. Theocracy was overthrown, government being by the new aristocracy of wealth, which considered government a prerogative of property, serving property, instead of God. There were murmurs of protest among the poor, both of the older stock and the newer immigration. The protest identified itself with the more radical aspects of Puritanism, with equalitarian democracy and liberty, an ideology that definitely colored American developments. In isolated cases, the protest projected proposals of ownership of property in common, implicit in the scriptural sanctions of the Puritan creed. The Morgans did not participate in this protest of the poor against the rich, not being inflamed by the ideology of liberty. Nor were they poor, being substantial landowners, conservative, prosperous, and God-fearing. One of them was an impassioned fighter against the newer radical ideas on property. This was the Reverend Joseph Morgan, a descendant of Miles More, 30 the House of Morgan, Gan's brother James. The reverend gentleman, it appears, was not precisely immaculate. He was on trial in one church for practicing astrology, countenancing promiscuous dancing, and transgressing in drink. The charges were not sustained, but the Reverend Joseph found it expedient to resign. He was suspended from the ministry in another church because of intemperance, but reinstated 2 years later on the intercession of many good people. 18, the Reverend Joseph Morgan, however, was sound as a bell on property. In a sermon delivered in 1732, he said 18. Covetousness, which is idolatry, must be the support of the world, and the misery of it both. Each man coveting to make himself rich carries on the public good. Thus God in his wisdom and mercy turns our wickedness to public benefit. This identification of God and the accumulation of riches is supplemented by an idealization of poverty. It were better for the most of people to be poor than to be bomb rich, for such have in general. Really a more comfortable life here and far less dangerous as to the next life. A rich man has a miserable life, for he is always full of fear and care, whereas a man that has but food and raiment with honest labor is free from these fears and sikarsadi need to pity and love rich men. Since the trend of this argument might conceivably discourage the accumulation of riches, the Reverend Joseph Morgan exclaims, "But what am I doing? If this discouraged people from seeking after riches, it would be a great detriment to the public, if not the undoing of the world. A rich man is a great friend to the public, while he aims at nothing but serving himself. God will have us live by helping one another, and since love will not do it, covetousness shall." There is in this sermon a social twist to the Puritan identification of religion and self-interest, of God and the pecuniary motives. In the older creed, riches and poverty were matters of individual relations with deity. Poverty was a sign of God's. Colonial Origins 21. Displeasure, the poor being ungodly outcasts. In that particular form, the creed could not survive the coming of social protest and more liberal ideas. The Reverend Joseph Morgan's formulation retains the religious sanction, but socializes the old creed by identifying it with the public good. In this, the Reverend gentleman probably paraphrased Mandeville's theory that private vices are public virtues, an important aspect of the ideology of developing capitalism. By identifying self-interest and religion, the Puritans imparted an irresistible moral passion to acquisition and accumulation, which survived the decay of their theology. Chapter 3, Joseph Morgan, innkeeper. They were learning to draw, the dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, and they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M. Alice in Wonderland. The curious error persists that J. Pierpont Morgan's grandfather was a captain in the Continental Army, the one. It was the great-grandfather, however, who fought in the Revolution, an American Cincinnatus retiring after the war to the ancestral farm near Springfield. The son, grandfather of J. Pierpont Morgan, was more enterprising and successful. This Joseph Morgan, born in 1780, is described in the family chronicles as a renowned hotel keeper who died in 1847, leaving a very large estate. Very formal, these chronicles. Joseph Morgan was an innkeeper, owner of stagecoach lines and stock speculator, a shrewd Yankee with one eye on the main chance and the other eye on any stray chance lying about. There were many chances for the enterprising. The Revolution liberated political and economic forces. In the midst of class conflicts over the forms and purposes of the new government, industrial changes shaped the nation in the image of capitalism. Dominant contemporary opinion interpreted the Revolution in terms of larger commercial opportunity. The American Revolution was not so much a liberation from political as from commercial thraldaten. A commercial movement favored by the merchant, producer, and manufacturer. Industry and commerce developed intensively while the West. Joseph Morgan, innkeeper. Ward migrations produced new wealth in larger markets. The chances of making money multiplied. But one could not make much money as a farmer in New England, where farming was becoming unprofitable and farms being deserted. The enterprising Joseph Morgan decided to make a change. He became an innkeeper. Commercial progress imparted new importance to taverns and stagecoach transportation. Taverns usually prospered exceedingly, our ancestors being heroic drinkers. A man was not considered drunk unless prostrate and unconscious. But the tavern was more than a place patronized by the world, the flesh, and the devil. It was a social, political, and business center, the stopping place of the stagecoach and of businessmen on their travels. Being the chief means of transportation, stages earned high profits, and the high profits bred competition and rate wars. In one case, a rate war ended in the competitors luring passengers with the offer of free fare plus free dinner and a bottle of wine. 5. Ownership of taverns and stage lines was often combined. It was big business. This flourishing business attracted Joseph Morgan. In 1817, he left the ancestral farm and, accompanied by his wife and their son, Junius Spencer Morgan, moved to Hartford. This city was the most important and prosperous trade center of the Connecticut River Valley, thriving upon the active movement of population and business. Taverns were probably not in the tradition of the Morgan ancestors, but man must often stoop to conquer, and Joseph Morgan's Inn set out its shield. 5. The owner being a shrewd and ingratiating host, Joseph Morgan's Inn prospered immediately. Ye host was neither brusque nor reserved, but greeted the stages and their passengers and mingled with the guests, who consumed enormous meals including much wine and rum. Joseph Morgan's Inn bid for the patronage of Hartford's prosperous, substantial citizens and got it. This patronage gave Morgan his chance and was responsible. 23, 24, the House of Morgan, for his fortune. In 1819, a group of Hartford's most important businessmen met at the inn and organized the Aetna Fire Insurance Company. Joseph Morgan was not among the organizers. Only a small part of the capital was paid in cash, the balance in promissory notes, it being anticipated that the profits would make unnecessary any more cash payments from stockholders. But progress was slow and discouraging, arousing the fear that assessments might become necessary to meet obligations. The price of stock declining disastrously, Joseph Morgan bought many shares for almost nothing, and possibly received shares outright from patrons of his inn, there being plenty of instances where stockholders boasted of having found someone who would take their shares off their hands, liabilities and all. Morgan's profit from a comparatively negligible investment must have been large, as within a few years Aetna's capital had become $3 million, of which only $196,000 was paid in by stockholders, the difference representing capitalized earnings and profits. This stroke of speculation made Joseph Morgan a really rich man. As the stages, impressive in their bright colors, showy animals, and picturesque drivers, drove up to Joseph Morgan's inn, ye host pondered the profits in the business. Tavern and stages could easily be combined in profitable joint enterprises. Hartford was a transportation center, one of the most important stage lines being the Middle Road line from Boston to New York via Hartford and New Haven, thence by steamboat to New York. Joseph Morgan acquired considerable interests in stage lines. There is a story that he eventually rose to the control of the chief roads of transportation in the state, 8, but of this there is no proof. Morganized enterprise was still to come. Then railroads appeared, and a shrill whistle blew, and the merciless age with its discord and din made a record as it passed, of the stage and the inn. Joseph Morgan, innkeeper. The railway accelerated the industrial and commercial revolution which produced disturbing social changes. Identified with the factory system and other developments, the railway was unsparingly condemned by people who clung to the old system of things. It was an invention of the devil encouraging capitalist monopoly and therefore anti-republican, calculated to introduce manufactures into the heart of the country, divert industry from the primitive and moral pursuits of agriculture, and bring on us the vices and miseries of manufacturing and commercial places. This expressed the agrarian revolt against developing. Industrialism, the struggle between agriculture and industry which was to persist in one form or another until the end of the century. Railroads drove the stages and their drivers out of business. The stage driver had been a flame of color in a generally drab life, a picturesque personage beloved of women and an ideal of youth. The populace sympathized with the stage driver in his downfall. Moreover, the new form of transportation also wrecked taverns which had depended largely upon the stagecoach for their business. Recognizing the irresistibility of the new form of travel and its consequences, Joseph Morgan prudently withdrew in time from the tavern and stage business, prosperously surviving a change which to others meant disaster. Travel was now a prerogative of the railroads, traveling guests of the hotel, and drink of the saloon. Joseph Morgan opened a large hotel in Hartford, more in consonance with the times and his position as an affluent and important citizen. Meanwhile, the son, Junius Spencer Morgan, born in 1809, was becoming an active and successful businessman. Starting at 16 as a bank clerk, Junius Morgan 5 years later entered independent business on his father's money, forming the New York City banking house of Ketchum, Morgan, and Company 11. Upon the dissolution of this partnership, Junius Morgan went into the dry goods business as a junior partner in Howe, 25, 16 the House of Morgan, Mather and Company, and in 1851 became a partner in J.M. Beebe and Company of Boston. Beebe, the son of a farmer, started in the retail business and then acquired undisputed leadership as a wholesale merchant. When a customer doubted his resources, Beebe proudly answered, "This store is good for $1 million." It was. The firm soon became J.M. Beebe, Morgan and Company, testifying to Junius Morgan's resources and business capacity. One of the junior partners in Beebe, Morgan and Company was Levi P. Morton, the same Morton who in later years was first a financial ally and then subordinate of J. Pierpont Morgan, at this time still, in high school. As most other affluent merchants, Morgan and Beebe engaged actively in banking and insurance, Beebe himself dabbling in railroad promotion. 14. Neither the temperament nor the activity of Junius Spencer Morgan was dramatic. Perseverance and commercial rectitude constituted his most important characteristics, particularly rectitude, in an age when the following Morton suggestion could appear in a business journal. The proper course for a merchant to pursue when he fails is to go deliberately to work. When he finds he is to fail and cannot help it, if he owes $500,000, he should immediately buy to the extent of $1 million, then turn it into cash, say $800,000. Then report that his failure is an immensely bad one, and that the unfortunate merchant will never pay 2 cents on the dollar. In this way, he will be able to purchase all his debts for 10 cents on the dollar, or $100,000. This leaves him clear in bank or United States stocks $700,000. All will join in saying, "What an honest man." Let him give up every dollar and not have enough to buy a morsel of victuals, and everyone will say, What a damn scoundrel. Junius Spencer Morgan, on the contrary, maintained a high code of business morality. One indication of this was dissolution of the partnership of Ketchum, Morgan Amp. Company Morris Ketchum was an unscrupulous speculator, engaged in many. Joseph Morgan, innkeeper. Shady business transactions, one foot an important reason for J.S. Morgan severing the partnership. This rectitude of J. Pierpont Morgan's father mingled with a ruthlessly acquisitive temperament, grim-mouthed, pompously dignified, coldly conservative, and antagonistic to democracy. The anti-democratic bias was developed in Junius Morgan by the business and social aristocracy of Hartford. Federalist reaction after the Revolution conquered the democratic radicals among the farmers, small traders, and mechanics, particularly in New England, where the clergy united with the mercantile aristocracy and the newly rich created by speculation to usurp the government. This aristocracy believed in government by the charm circle of the rich or well-born, and used the words rich, wise, good, and able interchangeably. Thomas Jefferson was a viper, the democratic movement a menace to civilization. The most reactionary of the New England states was Connecticut, ruled by an aristocracy which also ruled Hartford, the city founded by Thomas Hooker and his followers as a democratic challenge to the theocratic oligarchy of Massachusetts. The mood of this aristocracy was expressed by the Hartford wits, a group of merchants, lawyers, professors, and ministers clinging to ancestral customs and the stakes of power, scorning progress. Contemptuous of the plain men and women creating a more democratic society. The pioneers in the Great Westward Migration, which was to recast American civilization, were excoriated by the president of Yale. They are not fit to live in regular society. They are too idle, too talkative, too passionate, too prodigal, and too shiftless to acquire property or character. They are impatient at the restraints of law, religion, or morality. 18, another of the wits, Dr. Lemuel Hopkins, expressed the aristocracy's mood in hysterical verse. Led by wild demagogues, the factious crowd, mean, fierce, imperious, insolent, and loud, ate the House of Morgan. See from the shades on tiny pinions swell and rise the young democracy of hell. This was the mood in Hartford. Joseph Morgan, the innkeeper, trimmed his sails to its wind, tolerated if not accepted. But Junius Morgan was of the aristocracy, born and bred in the purple. Contempt of democracy was in him an ingrained characteristic. Aristocracy must conform to its age. And Junius Morgan interpreted the aristocratic mood in terms of the modern business aristocracy, which recognizes noblesse oblige by assuming the moral and philanthropic responsibility of community life. Junius Morgan was a vestryman of Christ Church, advisor of the Orphan Asylum, an incorporator trustee and vice president of the Young Men's Institute. This institute was a primitive model of business, civic, and moral organizations, formed for the moral and intellectual improvement of its members, the vain and frivolous pleasures of youth giving place to higher and more rational enjoyments. 20. The conservative Junius Morgan, however, was not in the least moved by progressive social ideals and movements. His interest in civic and moral endeavors was an expression of the Reverend Joseph Morgan's conviction that rich men carry on the public good transformed into civic endeavors, justifying and developing the ideology and practice of acquisition. Junius Morgan's successors are legion. Chapter 4. John Pierpont, Rebel. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains. Alice in Wonderland. Junius Spencer Morgan was the father of John Pierpont Morgan, born April 17, 1837. The mother was Julia Pierpont, daughter of John Pierpont, the clergyman, poet, and rebel. Disinterested opinion is that Pierpont was the most striking character among all of Morgan's forebears. The Morgans apparently preferred the shrewd, acquisitive. E. Innkeeper, one biographer, saying, Joseph Morgan was altogether less distinguished than Pierpont, but he has the credit of founding the Morgan fortune, while the other, after stormy, brilliant, but disappoint. Tincareer died as the holder of an obscure government post at W.A. In his own words, Pierpont was animated by love of right, freedom, and men, and corresponding hatred of everything that is at war with them. The meanness and crime which he saw about him in high places aroused flaming protest. Pierpont's political inspiration was Samuel Adams, professional agitator and rebel, relentless organizer of colonial revolutionary activity, antagonist of British and American aristocracy, the enemy of Alexander Hamilton and friend of Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine. Born in 1785, John Pierpont was successively academy teacher, private tutor, lawyer, and merchant. Urged to the church, he was ordained minister in 1819, accepting a call to 3P, the House of Morgan. Become pastor of the Hollis Street Church, Boston. Pierpont was a vital force in the Unitarian Church and one of the most active organizers of the American Unitarian Association. 4. But the man was more than a minister, he was a social rebel. Compact of scriptural austerity, righteous indignation, and moral passion, John Pierpont's religion was warmed by humanitarian aspirations for social betterment. It is upon the great breathing mass of the community, Pierpont insisted, that the Christian minister is to act. Although couched in terms of "Thus saith the Lord," his revolt was determined by contemporary social conditions and aspirations, an expression of the libertarian enthusiasm which swept New England prior to the Civil War. This movement of social and humanitarian protest was a product of the Industrial Revolution, which was particularly active in New England. Old institutions, class privileges, and ideas crumbled under the impact of capitalist development. The old commercial aristocracy declined, and by 1834, about 85% of Boston's merchants were identified with manufacturing enterprises. The advances in well-being of farmers and workers were trifling compared with the accumulation of riches by the factory owners and their merchandising allies, intensifying economic and social inequality. Labor was industrially oppressed and socially degraded, the workers complaining of the low estimation in which useful labor is held by the prosperous. Unions appeared, strikes and independent labor political action, shocking the aristocracy of money and culture. Securing universal suffrage and free public schools, which were condemned as un-American and a threat to the republic. Agriculture was becoming unprofitable, farms being abandoned, and the westward migration almost depopulated New England of its old stock, while immigrants flocked in as raw material for the factory system. These immigrants, mostly Irish and German, were despised in much the same manner as their descendants later despised the immigrants. John Pierpont, rebel. From Southern Europe, their radical ideas of equalitarian democracy sharpening the hatred. On the frontier clamored the new pioneer democracy, independent, scornful of privilege, and in control of the presidency under Andrew Jackson. The old order was breaking down, the new still a confusing chaos. The sufferings, resentments, and instability produced by social change aroused protest, humanitarianism, millennial aspirations. In the twilight zone between the old and the new order, reform movements and romantic enthusiasms flourished. It was a mixed crop, mingling reactionary and progressive protest against the new state of things. Gentle Unitarian melancholy mourning the old familiar order, and then merging with the new flaming protest against social injustice, dreams of utopian socialism. Hopes of restoring the old social equilibrium, transcendentalist philosophy, labor organization and action, the strident anti-slavery movement of William Lloyd Garrison and other agitators. James Russell Lowell expressed the rebel mood. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold sways the future. The social sap was stirring, in John Pierpont among many others. But that was not the mood of the majority, which felt that the misery of the Industrial Revolution was justified by its profits. Conditions in the factories were bad, very bad, but contemporary opinion persisted in sentimentalizing the situation, as in the following apology. The principles of our holy religion are too deeply implanted in the soil to further that course of policy which might lead either to vice or ignorance, and it is well known that in no other part of the globe are moral. Principles more widely diffused than in that particular section of the Republic where the manufacturing system most extensively prevails. This complacent sentimental indifference infuriated Pierpont. He did not yearn for the past, but was concerned with the present and the future. Flamingly, unyieldingly, he preached. 31. The Word of God in terms of social action. The pulpit was his forum. So many, said Pierpont, even of the professed disciples of Jesus, have lived after the flesh, minding things of the flesh, and so few, comparatively, after the Spirit, minding things of the Spirit. Dare we state the amount that shall exhibit fairly the relative amount of our service to God and to mammon? In a sermon comprising an imaginary discussion between an apostle and a new convert who objected to the burning of the Ephesian books, John Pierpont categorically rejected the idea that the rights of property are supreme over life and progress. The fashions of this world pass away, and with them must pass away the employments that depend upon those fashions. All those who are connected, at any time, with the existing order of things, when that order gives place to a better, must give place to those who bring in the better. Or must themselves take hold of that which is better. Will even Roman righteousness consider the claims of the Druid minister to be left alone in his business? When the merchants of the earth shall weep, because no man buyeth any more merchandise of slaves, and the souls of men, what will become of those, or of their vocation? Who now so curiously braid the slave driver's thong? And well may the craftsmen tremble for their trade, when the gods are falling whom it is their trade to serve. Aye, the scenes of human duty and trial change with the ever-changing circumstances of human life. The principles of the moral government of God, and the rules by which duty is measured, are as unchangeable as God himself. The social creed in these scriptural images is simple and direct. You can TB, let alone in your business, if it doesn't serve humanity. The opposite of Junius Morgan's creed, and of his son, J. Pierpont Morgan. One of the reforms urged by John Pierpont was the abolition of imprisonment for debt. This atrocious law which weighed the House of Morgan, John Pierpont, Rebbe 33 Albanian Lex, most heavily upon the poor, was condemned by labor organizations as a law that makes poverty a crime and a remnant of the feudal system. An average of persons were imprisoned for debt yearly in the United States, in Boston alone. One half of these imprisonments were for debts of less than $20. In Boston, a blind man with a dependent family was imprisoned for a debt of $6. In Salem, a veteran of Bunker Hill for a few dollars. In Providence, a widow for 68 cents, imprisoned by the man to save whose property from fire her husband had lost his life. 11. The indecency of the law aroused Pierpont, and his denunciations were frequent and savage. Temperance was another issue. Pierpont's approach was more social than individual, his invective being directed primarily against business exploitation of drink. He urged temperance, not prohibition, serving wine at his table. Drink being morally, economically, and politically a definite power in New England. Pierpont's agitation aroused the hostility of powerful vested interests. But the great issue was slavery, and John Pierpont was an ardent abolitionist, active in organizing the New England Anti-Slavery Society, a comrade of Garrison, and a frequent contributor to the Liberator. The slavery issue was now inflaming the nation, and Pierpont unflinchingly preached resistance to the great wrong. New England preferred slavery to disturbance in spite of its finest representatives favoring abolition. The aristocracy of money and culture was prosperous, comfortable, let us alone. Slaving, moreover, had contributed immensely to colonial New England's wealth, and many a merchant still reaped riches from smuggling black ivory, while the aristocrats of Cambridge built their mansions on proceeds of West Indian slave plantations. 12. Still more important, the textile mills depended upon southern cotton, and the manufacturers, eager not to antagonize the Slavocracy, were almost solid against the agitators. The irrepressible Khan. 34. The House of Morgan. Flicked as yet was irrepressible only in the minds of far-seeing. Radicals. Uncompromising as Garrison, John Pierpont identified abolition with the struggle against reaction in general. His mood is expressed in the following stanzas from one of his poems. "Ay, slaves of slaves, what, sleep ye yet? And dream of freedom while ye sleep? Ay, dream while slavery's foot is set. So firmly on your necks, while deep the chains her quivering flesh endures gnaw like a cancer into yours? Ha! Say ye that I've falsely spoken, calling you slaves? Then prove you're not. Work a free press. Yell, see it broken. Stand to defend it. Yell, be shot. Oh yes, but people should not dare print what the Brotherhood won't bear." 18. Pierpont condemned the fugitive slave law as a covenant with Judas, and his answer to the argument that it was constitutional was this: "What if it is? If the Constitution justifies wrong, I am bound to transgress the Constitution. If I see even the Constitution of the United States in my path, it shall not hinder, it shall help me on my way, for I will mount upward by treading it under my feet." 14. These utterances, barbed with indignation, invective, and elegy greater than exceedingly disturbed Pierpont's congregation. The Sunday-go meeting mood was of gentle meditation on the hereafter, communing comfortably with deity, and reconciling religion and self-interest. But this madman insisted on identifying Christ's teachings with everyday life and proposed disturbingly radical intervention in social struggles. The congregation was indignant, at least the majority was. Why? John Pierpont, rebel. Shouldn't Pierpont conform to the advice of the Reverend Francis Parkman, acted upon by the overwhelming majority of ministers to avoid certain vexed and complicated questions, such as slavery? Dr. Parkman imposed comfortable limits on the task of the clergyman: to preach the unchangeable word, to offer up with a pure heart the prayers of the people, to maintain in their simplicity and sanctity the ordinances of our faith, to watch for souls, maintaining the quiet tenor of his way, not entangling himself with the passing interests of this life. Such an one will approve himself to God as a good minister. 11. But to John Pierpont this was a paltering with the faith and compromise with evil, an evasion of the social tasks of religion. The Christian minister was to act upon the great breathing mass of the community, religion being the sword of social justice. The prophets of the Old Testament did not avoid vexed and complicated questions, nor maintain the quiet tenor of their way. That was the way of peace, undoubtedly, but not of righteousness. And so Pierpont in the pulpit thundered against social wrongs, particularly against the wrong of slavery, and justified his procedure by scriptural authority. Part of the congregation protested, but Pierpont was implacable. In 1838, the friction broke into war. A committee of the congregation, representing a bare majority, asked the pastor to avoid exciting subjects, above all, the abolition of slavery, to which Pierpont answered, "If I could consent that any topic should be taken out of the cognizance of my pulpit, it should be someone that is not exciting." He struggled, becoming more bitter. The opposition accused Pierpont of interfering with the laws of the land, of commercial dishonesty and moral impurity, the moral impurity consisting of using the word whore in a lecture, and demanded his resignation. The pastor refused to resign, insisting on a trial before a church court. "To me, it is fatal if your charges are true. To you, if they are false and malicious. Either meet me upon." 36. The House of Morgan, them, or retract them. Lieutenant, apparently afraid of a trial, the oppo. Sisson insisted on resignation and refused to pay the pastors salary. Unyielding John Pierpont secured the trial he insisted upon. The formal complaint to the Ecclesiastical Council comprised a series of charges impeaching Pierpont's moral character, but the burden of the complaint was the pastor's too busy interference with questions of legislation on the subject of prohibiting the sale of ardent spirits, too busy interference with questions of legislation on the subject of imprisonment for debt, too busy interference with the popular controversy on the subject of the abolition of slavery. 18. The trial was held in 1841 and lasted 6 months, arousing large public interest. Pierpont retracted nothing and was triumphantly sustained by the council, which dismissed the moral charges and, while disapproving of some phases of Pierpont's controversial activities, decided there was nothing to justify his removal. On appeal, the Supreme Judicial Court sustained the decision. Having received vindication, John Pierpont resigned his pastorate. The resignation was accepted. While as uncompromising as Garrison on slavery, Pierpont favored the abolitionists who broke with Garrison on the issue of independent political action. He was active in organizing the Liberty Party and its candidate for governor of Massachusetts. Appreciating that slavery was interwoven with other social problems, labor, government corruption, the seizure of the public lands by northern speculators and southern slaveholders, Pierpont accepted the merger of the Liberty Party with the Free Soil Party and was one of its congressional candidates. 0. Although not abolitionist, the Free Soil Party was against the extension of slavery to new states and pledged itself to maintain the rights of free labor against the aggression of the slave power and secure free soil to a free people. The new party, moreover, favored granting public lands free to settlers, a popular demand which culminated in the Home. John Pierpont, rebel, Stead Act of 1862, and was supported by labor groups which recognized that the influence of slavery is against labor and reform. 21. The Free Soil Party was assailed by the Whigs and Democrats, who dodged the slavery issue as violently revolutionary, but it was unflinchingly accepted by John Pierpont and directly contributed to organization of the Republican Party. Then, Civil War. The 76-year-old rebel, still a fighter, enlisted as chaplain in the army that was to end slavery. In April 1865, Pierpont's 80th birthday was celebrated in Washington, becoming a celebration of the final victory of the anti-slavery cause. William Lloyd Garrison greeted the old rebel as distinguished for independence of thought, boldness of speech, fearlessness of investigation, and an untiring interest in the cause of progress and reform on the broadest scale. 23. John Pierpont was of the breed of the scriptural prophets, to whom religion was not the salvation of miserly souls, but the flaming sword of righteous social struggle, expressing the deeper, finer nature of Puritanism. 37. Chapter 5th, Finance. George Peabody and Junius Morgan. How puzzling all these changes are. Never sure what I'm going to be from one minute to another. So many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. Alice in Wonderland. John Pierpont's rebel mood was not the mood of a nation being shaped by developing industrialism, simply an accompaniment and complement of that development. It was distinctively an age of material progress, preparing the conquest of a continent of unlimited natural resources and potential wealth. Like all elemental forces, this upthrust of material progress was ruthless, impatient of restraint, and often terrifying in its immediate consequences. But it was dynamic, irresistible, and progressive in the larger final meanings. While John Pierpont's flaming rebellion was magnificent, the movement of material progress determined issues and decisions. Out in the Western Plains, pioneers built up a new agrarian nation, producing an agricultural surplus and an insistent demand for manufactured goods. In the East, in New York, Pennsylvania, and New England, the factory system established itself firmly stimulated and sustained by widening markets. Manufacturers grew quickly after the Revolution, but their growth was now positively feverish, particularly the textile industry and iron and steel. 1. Railroad construction was still more feverish. In 1828, there were 3 miles of railroads. Finance. Peabody and Morgan, 39. 1,417 miles in 1837. And 24,476 in 1,857.2. Exploitation and acquisition, regardless of means and purposes, dominated men's ideas and actions. Opportunity was interpreted in terms of the small businessman's ideal of making one's pile in a regime of free and equal competition, and business enterprise moved irresistibly onward. While accepting the ideal of laissez-faire in making and retaining profits, developing capitalism was not in the least doctrinaire and modified the ideal by proposing that of paternalistic government benevolently aid industry and commerce by legislation and direct money grants. This was the American plan, which agrarians opposed on the ground that it neglected their interests. The independent, embattled pioneers, sensing their power, transformed the philosophical agrarianism of Thomas Jefferson into the practical politics of Andrew Jackson's homespun democracy, captured the government, and temporarily smashed the American plan. Jacksonian democracy was violently antagonistic to aristocracy, but the conquest of the West was to develop its own middle-class aristocracy out of speculation, the rise in realty values and commercial growth. This aristocracy united with Eastern industrialists and financiers and reintroduced the American plan under other forms. The struggle between agrarianism and industrialism, then as later, was waged upon financial issues. As capitalist industry developed, money became the dominant form of expression of economic activity. In the primitive colonial economy, money was scarce and banks still scarcer. As settlements and trade grew, money multiplied, but banks did not become important until after the Revolution. The widening and specialization of markets, arising out of the transfer of manufactures from the home to the factory, the development of production for profit instead of use, and the consequent rapid growth of trade required money and banks. Under the impact of these economic changes, banks and their capitalization increased swiftly. Money and the banks were becoming the decisive factor in 4.0 the House of Morgan, bringing together land, labor, and capital for purposes of production, annihilating the former independence of agrarians and artisans who now developed a struggle against the banks. There were two aspects of the struggle. One was the protest of people clinging to the older primitive economy and who, appreciating that the banks constituted the heart of capitalism, opposed banks as ensuring the supremacy of the new capitalist economy. In 1819, an economist identified banks with corporations, the object of which, he insisted, was to create artificial power, cause a more unequal division of property, and decrease the national wealth, concluding, "A bank is able to put almost any man down who shall attempt to do business without their agency and swallow up the proceeds of years of laborious industry." But there was another and more important aspect. Mismanagement, fraud, and failures flourished. The banks were often speculative, wildcat enterprises which multiplied overnight, garnered profits for the organizers, and crashed top five. Bank failures often produced riots and bloodshed. Moreover, the banks issued millions of worthless paper currency which constituted a fraud upon the public, and were usually more interested in speculation than in the legitimate requirements of industry and trade. These conditions bred corruption, bankers' cliques manipulating state governments, until the Philadelphia Public Ledger exclaimed, "Our corruption is excessive, and the banking system is a corrupter." 5. In a memorial to Congress in 1833, labor organizations in New York protested against the banks. Manufacture of paper currency is tending to diminish the value of money by increasing the price of all the fruits of labor. The homespun Jacksonian democracy identified the banks with the new capitalist forces oppressing farmers, pioneers, and artisans, and in denying a charter to the United States Bank tried to strike a blow at all banks. But banks multiplied, since capitalism functions through a network of complex finance, Peabody and Morgan 41. Social relations, and the struggle was to become one for the governmental control of the banking system instead of its annihilation. The pioneers and artisans, themselves inflamed with the ideal of individualism, could not see that the problem was one of social control, a problem that was to agitate and still agitates American life. While the struggle over banks and currency was being waged, there was another important financial development out of which arose the House of Morgan. This was the rapid growth of imports of European capital to finance American industry and trade. European capital had played a considerable role in colonial enterprises, while large amounts of money were borrowed abroad by the Continental Congress during the Revolution. By 1812, however, the national government's foreign debt was wiped out. But the immense expansion of agriculture, industry, and trade encouraged new borrowings of foreign capital by state governments and business enterprises. The United States was predominantly an agricultural economy, and its demand for goods and capital exceeded the domestic supply. Foreign trade increased fourfold between 1820 and 1860, and the import of manufactured goods almost sixfold. 8. There was an unfavorable balance of trade which increased steadily, our excess of imports over exports being paid for largely by the sale of American securities in Europe. State governments sold bonds abroad in order to finance canals and other improvements under the American plan, while corporate enterprises, particularly railroads, sold large amounts of their securities to foreign investors. By 1856, foreign investors owned $8,203,000,000 out of an aggregate of $1,407. 0.000000 of American national, state, city, and corporate bonds and stocks. 8. There was much popular opposition to these imports of foreign capital, a phase of the struggle against the new industrial and financial system, on the ground that foreign debts constituted an onerous burden upon the nation, encouraged specula. 42. The House of Morgan. Shone and the formation of corporations, but the opposition was futile. These international financial relations produced a number of investment banking houses specializing in foreign exchange, in the sale of American securities to European investors, the most important being George Peabody and Company, American investment bankers in London. In 1853, Junius Spencer Morgan became a partner in Peabody and Company, and upon George Peabody's retirement in 1863, the firm became J.S. Morgan and Company. This was the origin of the House of Morgan. George Peabody was an original. Shrewd Yankee and moneymaker, he moved urbanely in British society, retained his Republican simplicity, and declined Queen Victoria's offer of a baronetcy. Unlike Junius Morgan, Peabody was a humanitarian, interested in philanthropic social reform, and a friend of Robert Owen, the socialist businessman. Most of Peabody's fortune was spent in philanthropy, $2,500,000 to build model homes for the London poor, $3,500. 0,000 for Negro education in the South after the Civil War, and $2 million to American scientific and educational foundations. 10. This was unusual and startling in an age which insisted that John Jacob Astor had at heart the culture and elevation of the laboring class, because he gave $20, 0,000 to the Society for Aged Females and $25,000 to the German Society for an office in New York City to give advice and information without charge to all immigrants. 11. Louis Blanc considered George Peabody a friend of the poor, and Victor Hugo a rich man who would feel the cold. The hunger and the thirst of the poor. 12. Philanthropy is an evasion and not the solution of social problems. But where grim-mouthed Junius Morgan pompously engaged in forms of social and moral welfare constituting the defensive noblesse oblige of business aristocracy, George Peabody was moved by human misery and aspirations, a fine humanitarian with all the nobility and limitations of the humanitarian. Originally a grocery clerk and storekeeper, George P. Finance, Peabody and Morgan 43. Body soon became a prosperous merchant. The merchant capitalist was still the most important factor in business life, not the industrial or financial capitalist. Production being small-scale and isolated, merchants dominated producers in the movement of goods from producer to consumer. But as industry became larger and banking more important, many prosperous merchants, possessing abundant money resources, began to finance the production of goods as well as their distribution until they became exclusively investment bankers. Most of the important investment houses originated in the mercantile business: the House of Morgan, Brown Bros., Kuhn, Loeb and Company, J. and W. Seligman and Company. Lazard Frears and James Stillman, who built up the great National City Bank, started in the cotton merchandising business. The merchants Junius Morgan and Levi Morton ended as investment bankers, and so did George Peabody. Developing capitalism dethroned the merchant as the aristocrat of business. While still a merchant, George Peabody sensed the importance of new industrial and financial developments. He was a railroad pioneer, one of the incorporators and president of the Eastern Railroad, a road of 60 miles built in 1836. By amalgamation and lease, the Eastern became one of the most important New England railroads, paying higher dividends than most other railroads. 14. Peabody not only appreciated the importance of railroads in giving every aid to commerce and manufacturers, but also their political importance in strengthening the bonds of the Union and offsetting the evils to be apprehended from a too extended territory. 15. Railroad financing revealed to Peabody the significance and profitable character of capital importation. In 1835, he organized George Peabody and Company in London, specializing in foreign exchange and American securities. And in 1843, Peabody severed all his mercantile affiliations in order to devote himself exclusively to international banking. 1. Peabody's large fortune was acquired in the banking business between 1844 and 44, the House of Morgan. 1864. Everything I touched within that time, he said, and after years, seemed to turn to gold. 1. The American demand for foreign capital was almost insatiable, most of it being supplied by British investors who, in spite or because of the depressed well-being of the masses during the hungry 40s and after, managed to accumulate enough money to buy all sorts of foreign securities. Peabody and Company competed with the Rothschilds and the Barings for American financial business. And, got it, the Panic of 1837 shook American credit in Europe. George Peabody had foreseen this panic in 1836, writing to a friend that the rage for speculation which characterized the last 2 or 3 years must produce disastrous results. I have written to my partners to keep everything snug and be prepared for the emergency. 18. The industrial and financial interests accused the Jacksonian democracy of causing a panic by its attack upon the United States Bank in particular and financial institutions in general, but in reality the panic was caused by frenzied speculation, unregulated industrial development, incompetent and often dishonest banking, and, according to a contemporary business journal, the desire of gain at the expense of individuals and the public. Wildcat banks multiplied, speculation dangerously inflated all sorts of values, and the inevitable crash came, producing a large crop of business failures, wiping out savings, creating general unemployment and acute distress among the workers, particularly in manufacturing districts. 0. The panic spread to London, where 3 American houses were compelled to suspend payments owing to enormous and extravagant speculative engagements. 11. There was considerable liquidation of American securities and the rejection of new offerings. The situation was made still worse by several American states repudiating their foreign debts. State debts had increased from $12,790,000 in 1820 to I-70R0000 0000 in 1838, most of the bonds being owned in Europe. Finance, Peabody and Morgan 45. The basis for the development of American foreign investment banking on which George Peabody and Company thrived. The American plan actively encouraged industry by tariff protection and the grant of public money to aid private enterprise, particularly transportation improvements. By 1836, canals and railroads had absorbed more than $90 million, of which 50% was represented by state bonds, mostly owned by British investors. 28. There was considerable corruption in securing state money. Many of the enterprises were unscrupulously speculative and mismanaged, and some of the state governments did not make definite provisions to meet debt charges. Mismanaged speculative enterprises crashed in the 1837 panic. The situation progressively became worse. And in 1841, 9 states suspended interest payments and 3 repudiated their debts. This action shocked European investors and threatened the business of foreign investment banking. George Peabody called upon the states to preserve their commercial honor and pledged his word that they would soon resume payment of interest and fully redeem their obligations. 24 Peabody devoted himself to the task of restoring confidence in American credit and, according to Edward Everett, performed the miracle by which an honest man turns paper into gold by buying largely of depreciated state bonds, and while thus relieving the financial embarrassment of the states by raising their credit. He greatly increased his own fortune when these securities advanced in price owing to restored confidence. 25. Among the mismanaged enterprises largely financed by public money was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, the fiscal agents of which in England were Peabody and Company. This canal was the joint enterprise of Maryland, Virginia, and the national government to connect the Potomac and Ohio rivers. It was started in spite of the appearance of railroads, prudent and far-seeing businessmen insisting that railroads would not become practicable for years to come. Chartered at about the same time, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal and the Baltimore, 46 the House of Morgan, and Ohio Railroad engaged in a struggle for public and governmental support. The struggle flared up in Congress, where a speaker said that the Chesapeake Canal must give way to the superior improvement of railroads, while Chesapeake's president denounced the congressional delusion in favor of the railroad. 20. It was apparent drat railroads were more practicable than canals, but Chesapeake and Ohio persisted, securing more money from the national government and the state of Maryland too. Although this money was larger than the original estimate of construction costs, the canal was still uncompleted owing to mismanagement and waste. The money crisis in 1839 almost wrecked the enterprise, the directors complaining that its debt, secured by Maryland state bonds, permitted the banks and bankers to prescribe and enforce the time of payment and enrich themselves at the expense of the company by causing immediate sale of the bonds. This was apparently true, but the directors were seeking a scapegoat for their own mismanagement and persistence in an enterprise which should have yielded to the railroad. Of Chesapeake's debt, $1,250,000 was held in Europe. The security being bonds pledged with Peabody and Company. Owing to the impairment of Maryland's credit, these bonds depreciated considerably. But the directors complained that the sacrifices in Peabody's sales were excessive and that he has placed us in a most painful situation by refusing to accept the company's bills. 2. Peabody thereupon resigned as agent, refusing to become further involved in the affairs of a mismanaged corporation. Between 1840 and 1857, railroad construction developed feverishly and American railroad securities became favorites of. In order to lower construction costs, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company imported much indentured labor from Ireland and Holland. Illness decimated the workers, they revolted at the low wages and conditions of labor, and scores ran away. Some of the runaways were arrested in Baltimore. But B. Lehem THK imported Watke stigmatizes F. Ward St. Secretary, and their importation discontinued. Pro PFP ZZD and Devon 1 LKA Schwafalu and Ohio Canal. Finance, Peabody and Morgan 47. European investors, the rapid development of our rail transportation system being immensely facilitated by the import of foreign capital. Among the many railroad issues disposed of by Peabody and Company were stocks and bonds of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad in 1853. Which was unable to raise additional capital in the United States. While grants of public money by state governments aided the construction of railroads, such aid was not given by the national government until after 1850. Congress aided the railroads indirectly, however, by lower tariff rates on rails and other iron imports for railroad use against the iron manufacturers' protests, banking privileges and tax exemptions. Speculation, mismanagement, and corruption appeared in the railroads, although not assuming catastrophic proportions until after the Civil War. But already the Erie Railroad was infamous for its mismanagement and demoralization, coming into the clutches first of Jacob Little and then of Daniel Drew as the plaything of business buccaneers. Being a debtor nation, the United States pursued an almost consistently liberal foreign policy, usual in the case of debtor nations. There was an appetite for territorial aggrandizement, but it expressed itself in settlement of the American wilderness. Not imperialistic expansion, except for the southern Slavocracy's desire to annex Latin American lands in order to create a slave empire and offset the power of the northern free labor states. Manifest destiny was not to become an issue until the development of monopolistic industry and finance. Cornelius Vanderbilt, rising from ferry boats to steamships and master of unscrupulous competition, was mixed up in transportation enterprises in Nicaragua, out of which developed the first foreign American railroad. His franchise being confiscated by an American filibuster and resold to others, Vanderbilt resorted to the characteristic predatory methods of concessionaires to regain his property. It was then, 48, the House of Morgan. Anticipation of imperialism mildly, but it bore no immediate fruit. Internal development absorbed the United States. Developing swiftly, American industry astonished other nations at the London Industrial Exhibition in 1851. Participation in which by the United States was made possible by the financial aid of George Peabody, Congress making no appropriation. The exhibit of American manufacturers aroused enormous interest. The British marveled at 100 power tools being used to shape the parts of a Springfield rifle, and one journal declared that England had received more real benefit from the American exhibit than any other. Owing to its exceptionally large crop of inventors, most of whom received little from their inventions, the United States was improving rapidly upon industrial technique, being much in advance of other nations in the use of interchangeable mechanism, automatic machinery, and standardization. Between 1850 and I-860, iron and textile manufacturers increased 65%, and there was a substantial development of locomotive, machinery, and other iron and steel exports. But this progress was interrupted by alternate periods of prosperity and depression in industry and trade, culminating in the Panic of 1857, which almost wrecked Peabody and Company. It was worse in 1837. The distress in all manufacturing towns was absolutely sickening. Again, unregulated industrial development, overbuilding of railroads, frenzied speculation in western lands, and financial mismanagement reaped the whirlwind of business disaster. Peabody's American representatives, Duncan, Sherman and Company, were barely saved from bankruptcy. The crisis severely affected British industry and finance, and particularly the American houses there whose representatives in the United States could not remit. Peabody and Company were pressed for funds, their acceptances amounting to £2,300, at a time when money could be secured only through the Bank of England. Junius Morgan, who in 1853 had become a partner in Peabody and Company, negotiated with the bank for a finance. Peabody and Morgan, 49, loan of £800. 0000, and was crushed by the answer. The bank would make the loan, providing Peabody and Company agreed to cease business in London after 1858. But George Peabody was a fighter. He dared the bank to cause his failure, mobilized powerful British support, received the loan, and survived the crisis. Peabody practically retired after this, Junius Morgan becoming dominant in the firm. At this time, John Pierpont Morgan, 20 years old, was employed as a clerk by Duncan, Sherman, and Company, the firm having been saved from bankruptcy by Peabody Amp Company. Junius Morgan seized the opportunity to ask them to make his son a partner. Upon this being refused, the younger Morgan was set up independently in the banking business by his father, gradually assuming the functions of American representative of Peabody and Company. J. Pierpont Morgan was almost the only one of the captains of industry and finance coming to power after the Civil War who was not self-made but a rich man's son, Junius Morgan being a millionaire. It meant much in his rise to power. The young Morgan lived in Hartford until he was 12, was under the care of a physician for a few years owing to lung trouble, and at 14 entered the English high school in Boston. He did not mingle much with the other sons of wealth, being reserved, silent, and antagonistic. Morgan was average in school, slow, dignified, and ponderous, not brilliant but painstaking and plodding, mathematics being the one subject in which he showed decided talent. After graduation, his health still a source of worry, Morgan spent some time in the Azores and then made the grand tour of Europe, ending with 2 years at the University of Göttingen, where he distinguished himself in mathematics but in nothing else. 88. His son worried Junius Morgan. What shall I do with him? The father was worried by the young man's ingrowing reserve, his abrupt, domineering, almost morose manner, only. 50. Partly the result of an inbred arrogance of caste, and apparent lack of talent. No spark, no urge to work, which particularly worried old Junius, his dynastic impulse being to make a banker out of the only son to carry on the business of the House of Morgan. Junius Morgan succeeded, but only after. Another interval of worry. Beneath young Morgan's gruff, arrogant reserve was something sentimental, almost romantic, probably the Pierpont influence of his mother. He held it down, but it did mysterious things to him, flaring up an overwhelming love of a woman who was consumptive and approaching death. Amelia Sturgis, the beloved, declined Morgan's offer of marriage. But the youngster, 22 years old, insisted. The man who was to command now begged, who was to defy antagonists and public opinion now defied death. The beloved was in Paris, and there Morgan went, abandoning his business. More worry for old Junius. What shall I do with him? They married, and within 3 months she died, in spite of love's defiance of death. Romance never happened again. Morgan overwhelmed his sentimental, almost romantic quality in the gruff masculinity of the strong, silent man wrapped in the ecstasy of business. It survived in his love of medieval splendor and magnificence. The quality itself Morgan repressed as weakness. Power was to be his ideal, its pursuit his romance, love becoming the conquest of women as an appanage of power. Thereafter, J. Pierpont Morgan concentrated on banking, and old Junius ceased worrying. He took hold and never let go, energized by his will to power, never let go until 3 months before his death. Finance was becoming the dominant force in economic life, assuming new forms and functions. By identifying himself with finance and its crucial changes, Morgan was to rise to supreme power in the American scene. The story of the House of Morgan is the story of the transformation of American capitalism in the midst of an economic civil war by the centralization of industry and finance. The House of Morgan. Finance. Peabody and Morgan 51. Men may be significant as the multiplied expression of common men and common things. Usually the case with preachers and politicians, Morgan was significant in being the multiplied, concentrated expression of fundamental changes in industrial and financial institutions, of the power, splendor and magnificence of the American aristocracy of money. Part 2. Civil War. Chapter 6. War and Carbines. What do you mean by that? Said the caterpillar sternly. Explain yourself, E. I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, said Alice, because I'm not myself, you see. I don't see, said the caterpillar. I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, Alice replied very politely. KLLCT in Wonderland. Moral issues are ordinarily helpless against the force of economic institutions unless they express and serve competing institutions. The moral agitation of Garrison, Pierpont, and others against slavery was a declining force until it assumed new vigor by definitely becoming the ideology of an irrepressible social and political conflict. Industrial transformation developed a struggle between agrarianism and industrialism, which was complicated by slavery, the Slavocracy being itself agrarian. Industrialism shaped economic and political institutions antagonistic equally to agrarian democracy and Slavocracy. But northern agriculture, by its free and individualistic character, fostered capitalist enterprise, which was hampered by static and reactionary Slavocracy. Compromise as northern capitalism might, and persecute slavery agitators, its progressive economics compelled struggle against Slavocratic economics, driven desperate by the growing economic and political power of the North and its own inescapable alternative of expansion or downfall. The Slavocracy during its control of the national government fatally emphasized the irreconcilability of free labor and slave labor, of business enterprise and Slavocratic agriculture. The Southern 56 statesmen infuriated industry and finance by rejecting important legislative measures fostering industrial development, and they infuriated labor and frontiersmen by rejecting free soil proposals in their campaign to seize the western lands for. The Slavocracy. An uncompromisable struggle for power developed, the struggle for power of competing economic and political systems and institutions, transformed by the logic of events from a moral issue into an issue of practical politics. The struggle over slavery flared up in war. Liberation of the Negro, decided upon as a measure of war, constituted the ideology of the inexorable necessity of capitalism to crush Slavocracy. The war was a social war. Upon the opening of the war, John Pierpont, now 76 years old, enlisted as chaplain in the Union Army. His grandson of 24, J. Pierpont Morgan, was neither volunteer nor conscript, although a widower who did not remarry until 1865, marrying Frances Louisa Tracy. The issue being 3 daughters and 1 son, John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., born September 7, 1867. Rich men avoided the draft by hiring substitutes for $300, the providing of which was an organized profitable business. Advertisements offering to provide substitutes appeared frequently. Gentlemen will be furnished promptly with substitutes by forwarding their orders to the office of the merchants, bankers, and General Volunteer Association. Other potential captains of industry and finance besides Morgan did not fight during the Civil War, pacifism being rather common among them. Jay Gould was meditating, Husky Jim Fisk selling blankets to the government at Substantial. The House of Morgan, P. Pierpont to resign from the Army. Secretary Salmon Derision Ondeve, Treasury Department, compiling a digest of onions. Apparently there was a break between John Pierpont and his. BL Nugson LW, D. Unison. He died in 1868 in poverty. S. or less then was a promissory note for $1 sou endorsed by a Boston pub owner. James Grant Wilson, Bryant and Highfriend, pp. 381 2. War and Carbines 57. Profit, William H. Vanderbilt farming, John D. Rockefeller investing savings in an oil refinery, Andrew Carnegie in civilian service. And Philip Armour speculating in pork, which he sold short on the approach of Union victory, clearing $2 million. The call to make men free did not thrill these men, calculating the chances of becoming rich, Others might die, but they must amass. The son of Junius Morgan concentrated on business during the war under the firm name of J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, private bankers. On Exchange Place, in the shadow of the Wall Street he was later to rule, the arrogant, massive youngster plied his business, mostly foreign exchange. Nothing about him attracted attention or indicated the coming master of money, unless it was his concentration on business. Men later tried to create an aura for the young Morgan, attributing to him an impressive utterance. We are going someday to show ourselves to be the richest country in the world in natural resources. It will be necessary to go to work and to work hard, to turn our resources into money to pay the cost of the war just as soon as it is ended. 3, which was neither impressive nor original, being the common talk of the day. Morgan was an up-and-coming youngster ploddingly engaged in the banking business in a comparatively small way and pursuing the ordinary routine of making money, of which the war was simply an aspect. In doing this, and while awaiting the rich future, J. Pierpont Morgan participated in a transaction characterized by a committee of the House of Representatives as fraudulent, an effort to obtain from the government some $49,000 over and above the value of the property sold, and a crime against the public safety. 4. This transaction of Morgan's was included among the war contract frauds, revealing an extraordinarily low level of business morality. 6 weeks after the war started, the New York Times declared that very general, and we fear well-grounded complaints and apprehensions exist of great corruption, and 58. The House of Morgan, wastefulness in contracts for Army and Navy. The House of Representatives immediately appointed a select committee to investigate, the chairman of which wrote privately to Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase of an organized system of pillage, robbery, fraud, extravagance, peculation. The charges were amply proven by the facts. In the business world, speculation, profiteering flourished menacingly and unashamed, multiplying the burdens of war and the chances of disaster. While the lonely man in the White House, the practical politician becoming great under tragic pressure, tried to impose his dreams upon events and soldiers, yielded their full measure of devotion to the music of Az. He died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Buccaneers in the business community interpreted the mighty events of an epic age in terms of profit and loss. The soul of the nation was not in them, but in the men who answered the call for volunteers, singing as they marched, "We are coming, Father Abraham 300, 0000 more," in these men and in the men who aroused their devotion. Profiteers swooped upon the government in the North and in the South. Systematic customs frauds prevailed, which Secretary Chase reported had been successfully carried on for a series of years. A legion of traitors and government patronage sprang up who, by corrupt political influence, secured contracts which they sold to manufacturers at a large profit. The manufacturers raised their prices accordingly, and a trifle more. Fraud tainted much of the money paid by the government on contracts, and the balance was tainted by excessive profits. The Committee of the House of Representatives in 1862 reported large frauds in the purchase of ordnance in stores, Treasury and War Department employees, contractors, politicians and bankers conspiring to swindle the government. Profits from the sales of arms to the government have been enormous, said the investigating committee, and realized by a system of brokerage as unprincipled and dishonest as war and carbines 59, unfriendly to the success of the nation, as the plottings of actual treason. 8. Neither the investigation nor ousting of the Secretary of War improved matters much, leading one representative in 1863 to say, "After the lapse of 2 years, we find the same system of extortion, frauds and peculation prevailing." The cry went up, "Corruption will ruin us." The investigating committee reported frauds in 104 cases and refused payment of $17 million out of $50,000, 0000 on contracts. J. Pierpont Morgan appeared in a case as financing the sale to the government of the government's own arms at an extortionate profit. The facts are in the congressional reports. Case number 97, J. Pierpont Morgan. Claim for payment of ordnance stores, referred by special direction of the Secretary of War. Claimed $58,175. 18. In 1852, certain unserviceable ordnance stores were condemned by inspecting officers of the Army, among them a batch of Hall's carbines, which were thereafter sold from time to time at prices ranging from $1 to $2 apiece. Upon the outbreak of war, an adventurer, Arthur Eastman, negotiated for the purchase of these carbines. After haggling over price and terms, the War Department issued instructions to sell Eastman 5,000 carbines at $350, to be paid for at once. The prospective buyer, having no money of his own, tried to buy the carbines 1,000 at a time, payable in 90 days, and was refused. Eastman was unable to raise the necessary money until a corrupt speculator, Simon Stevens, agreed to make a loan of $20, 0000, in return for a lien on the carbines, which Eastman had not purchased and which were still government property, and an agreement to sell them to Stevens at $12.50 apiece. All Eastman offered in this transaction was a letter from the War Department, which magically produced a profit of $20,000. It was not Stevens' money which Eastman received, but a draft issued by J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, which was sold by Eastman to Ketchum, Son and Company, who, according to Morris Ketchum's testimony, expected to get their money out of Mr. Morgan when 6-0 the House of Morgan. He gets it. Ketchum refused to tell the investigating committee what his profit was on the deal, that being my private business which the government has no right to inquire into. Although desperately in need of arms, the government was not using any of the Hall carbines, condemned as unfit and dangerous for military use. Simon Stevens offered the carbines for sale in a telegram to General J.C. Fremont saying, "I have 5,000 carbines for sale," which was untrue. No purchase having been made, and the carbines being still government property stored in a government arsenal. Fremont, needing arms badly and in business as gentle as a girl and confiding as a woman, 12 accepted Stevens' offer, the price being $22. The day after the receipt of Fremont's telegraphic acceptance, Arthur Eastman bought the 5,000 carbines at $3.50. A piece from the War Department, payment of $17,486 being made by J. Pierpont Morgan. When the sale was made to General Fremont, the arms were still the property of the government, reported the investigating committee, the proposal being to sell the government its own arms. The government not only sold one day for 17,486 arms, which it had agreed the day before to repurchase for 109,912, making a loss to the United States on the transaction of 92,426, but virtually furnished the money to pay itself the 17,486 which it received. 13, moreover, the arms were more dangerous to the Union troops than to the Confederates. The conspirators shipped 2,500 carbines. Apparently apprehensive, they did not ship the other carbines until payment of 55. 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or the first batch had been received by J. Pierpont Morgan, that is, 40 days after the sale, although General Fremont had urged hurry. Their apprehensions were justified. Payment for the second batch of carbines was refused, and Morgan's bill for 58. 175 turned over to the Secretary of War, who referred it to the committee investigating government contracts. After severely castigating the participants in the transaction, the committee allowed 9,678 on Morgan's. War and carbines. Claim plus brokerage of $1,330. The claim for payment, Morgan insisted, was justified because his house had made advances in good faith to Mr. Stevens on the security of his agreement with General Fremont. This claim of good faith was dismissed by the committee since Morgan declined to disclose the terms upon which the advances were made to Stevens, the committee said. Nor is it an unfair inference from the unwillingness evidenced by the House in question, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, to state the terms on which their advances were made, that if these terms were disclosed, they might supply evidence that, during the negotiations for funds, doubts as to the sufficiency of the security had actually presented themselves, and that the confidence claimed to have been felt by them was largely mingled with distrust. The committee included in its decision a discourse to Stevens, Morgan, Ketchum, and Eastman on equity and good citizenship. It is impossible to regard such a transaction as having been entered upon in good faith, and as having for such reason an equitable claim to be confirmed. In France, during periods of civil commotion, may often be seen inscribed on the bridges, monuments, and other public structures the words, "Committed to the guardianship of the citizens of France." In our country, it should not be regarded as a romantic stretch of political morality to declare that all public interests ought to be regarded as under similar guardianship, more especially in time of trial and need like the present. He cannot be looked upon as a good citizen, entitled to favorable consideration of his claim, who seeks to augment the vast burdens, daily increasing, that are to weigh on the future industry of the country, by demands on the Treasury for which nothing entitled to the name of an equivalent has been rendered. The carbine scandal assumed considerable political importance, being one of many frauds reported in General Free. 61. F.A. Mont's Army. Although the frauds were many, General Grant complained of bad muskets, unfit beef, poor hay, and extortionate prices. 14. There was proof of incompetence in Fremont's case, and the investigating committee proposed to oust him. But Fremont was an implacable enemy of slavery, and there was an immediate rally to his defense by men who considered the proposed ouster a move against the anti-slavery forces, and of men who despised Abraham Lincoln. Thaddeus Stevens interpreted the issue in terms of Fremont's honesty, integrity, and patriotism, and said that while Simon Stevens' speculation may not be very pleasant to look at, it was a legitimate business transaction. 11. The implacable old man, wrapped in the struggle to crush the Slavocracy by any and all means, cynically brushed aside the issue of corruption, as he did in the post-war struggle against the South. Nevertheless, General Fremont was ousted on charges of incompetence. The investigating committee's castigation was wasted on Simon Stevens, while Morgan withdrew from the case. Stevens persisted in his claim, and it was granted in 1866 by the Court of Claims on a strictly technical decision. The court, 4-1, decided there was no proof of fraud and accepted Stevens' contention that he was the legal owner of the carbines at the time of their sale to Fremont, in spite of their being still government property and stored in a government arsenal. It was General Fremont's duty to buy those arms, declared the court. Should he leave his troops unarmed and suffer rebellion to rush in unresisted? Since Fremont did buy the carbines, the government must abide the responsibility and pay. This decision assured payment of. Simon Stevens was mixed up in the customs frauds in New York City. He refused to answer an investigating committee's questions about his profits. HBR Nelral HT had insisting that the government has no right to inquire MTO my private bears. Under pressure, however, Stevens revealed having put $520,000 for the contract, another $542. 0000 in bribes in JRSSEL SNH Cone TRRT. L House of Representatives, 3rd Cs, 67th Cong. Court of Claims, 1862-3, pp. 83. The House of Morgan, War, and Carbine 63. All the dead horse claims against the government held by a horde of fraudulent contractors are won. It was a decision, moreover, in accord with the mood of cynical corruption which flourished in the national government after the Civil War, unscrupulous, pervasive, and appalling. 66. The House of Morgan. Business flourishing, an organization was formed which moved to larger quarters where bulls forced up the price of gold to the strains of Dixie. 4. The price of gold being identified with the military struggle, if Union defeat forced up the price of gold, the bulls sang. Den, I wish I was in Dixie. Hooray! Hooray! In Dixieland, I'll take my stand to live and die for Dixie. If Union victory forced down the price of gold, the bears sang. The stars of heaven are looking kindly down. The stars of heaven are looking KJ and Dilly down. The stars of heaven are looking kindly down on the body of old John Brown. Only in this case, the stars were looking down on profits garnered by speculators. Or the bears might sing, we'll hang Jeff Davis on a sour apple tree, speculators being more vengeful than soldiers at the front. The songs with which soldiers eased their souls were also sung by the patrioteering soldiers of speculation. Most of the dealers in foreign exchange speculated heavily in gold, the fluctuations yielding immense profits. Morgan, owing to his foreign affiliations, was in an excellent position to exploit the situation. In one spectacular coup forcing up the price of gold, Morgan and an accomplice reaped a profit of $160,000, which was big business in those days. 6. Morgan, too, was a bull on gold, but we don't know whether in garnering the profits he sang, "Hooray! Hooray! I'll live and die for Dixie." Probably not, considering his habitual and temperamental reserve. Morgan's accomplice in this particular speculative coup was a man of his own age, Edward B. Ketchum, and unscrupulous. Speculating in Go 67 Albanian Lex, speculator and junior partner in Ketchum, Son and Company. Edward's father, Morris Ketchum, had been a partner of Junius Morgan in the banking business and associated with J. Pierpont Morgan in the scandalous sale of carbines to the government. The Ketchums engaged in all sorts of shady speculative enterprises and were among the most active speculators in gold, their gold bullings being stigmatized as embarrassing to the government. Although Morris Ketchum was Secretary Chase's loan representative in New York City, his operations were considered as not always in the government interest. 6. Edward Ketchum proposed a speculative coup in gold to Morgan, shrewdly calculated to capitalize recent military events and the gold requirements of importers. Early in 1863, gold was selling at $163. A series of Union victories produced considerable price declines. The Gettysburg victory sent the price down 5 points in one day, and the capture of Vicksburg down another 5 points. These events and conviction of the coming capture of Charleston resulted in gold falling to $125, the gold price range in September being $126 to $29. Importers and other buyers of foreign exchange expected the price to go still lower, the war might even end, and postponed buying to meet maturing bills. Then the onrushing Union troops met bloody reverses, Charleston was not captured, and the agonizing military struggle settled down to a war of attrition. Clearly, although Union victory was assured, the end was still far off. Slowly, the price of gold began to rise. The demand for gold by importers who had postponed buying foreign exchange was increased by active imports and moderate exports. By creating an artificial scarcity of, in 1863, Morris Ketchum floated another of his characteristic enterprises. This was the incorporation of General J.C. Fremont's Mariposa estate in California, from which millions in gold had been taken. The corporation issued 100,000 shares of stock priced at $100, but without 1 cent of working capital. Ketchum received 75,000 shares, which he easily disposed of to a get-rich-quick public. In 1865, the shares sold at 8 Celsiuses. Fremont was victimized. New York Times, August 21st, 1865. 68, the House of Morgan. Gold, the price could be forced up, and the buyers who had to have gold would be at the speculators' mercy. After outlining the situation to Morgan, young Ketchum proposed that they buy $4 million or $5 million in gold on joint account with Peabody and Company. Ship half abroad and resell the remainder at home. Considering the scarcity of available gold the move would create and the active demand for foreign exchange, they could sell at practically their own price. The profits would be large and sure, since the buyers of foreign exchange would be helpless to resist under the prevailing conditions. After being approved by Morris Ketchum, the speculation got underway conspiratorially. Gold was purchased secretly, being maneuvered to appear as ordinary business transactions. Covered up and timed perfectly, the operation conquered its immediate objectives. Gold rose to 143. There is no special cause for the rise, said the New York Times, other than a disposition to speculate on the current demand of customs and export. The Morgan-Ketchum conspiracy was still unknown. Although the speculators covered up their tracks, the scarcity of gold and the rising price indicated the engineering of a coup. This was clear on Saturday, October 10th, when $1,150, 0,000 of an unexpectedly large shipment of gold to England was identified as shipped by Young House and Exchange Place, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, respectably connected on the other side, but whose regular business and exchange would be called large at 10% of the sum. The New York Times adding, "This maneuver is not wholly new to the market, having been tried, but with no satisfactory result. Last spring it may succeed better in the present instance, as there is an active demand for bills." The successful speculative coup created almost a corner in gold. The regular dealers were caught unawares, and the buyers of gold and foreign exchange were desperate. The price of gold went to 149. Brokers tried to break the price by selling gold, but Ketchum, who was not known as speculating in gold, Morgan's associate, bought all the gold offered and bid the price higher. By October 16, gold was selling at 156, exchange on London rising sympathetically to 171. Not only were the buyers of foreign exchange helpless, but also a considerable short interest which had bought at 145 to 47. The conspirators reaped the large joint profit of $160,000. 1 week after the Morgan-Ketchum coup, the price of gold declined to 145.11. This speculation of Morgan's disorganized the foreign exchange market temporarily and made still more difficult the carrying on of foreign trade. It was not the necessary expression of economic forces, but willful and predatory manipulation. A whole series of such manipulations interfered with trade and forced the high prices of all goods still higher, for while speculation was not the cause of high prices, it was an important contributory factor. Contemporary opinion of the gold speculators was scorching. The New York Times ascribed the enormous and unprincipled speculation in gold to a knot of unscrupulous gamblers who care nothing for the credit of the country. 12 at a Union League meeting, it was urged that Congress at once order the erection of scaffolds for hanging the speculators to one. It was the fact of its objective disloyalty that particularly inflamed the people against speculation. The love of gain was fed by sacrificing the national credit and encouraging disloyalty, declared a contemporary observer. How would an undertaker be regarded who, acquiring his wealth and burying the dead, rejoiced in the sufferings of those around him? Yet the gold brokers rejoiced over human slaughter and national defeat because their gains were thereby increased. 14. The speculators were bulls on gold and bears on the Union. Men stand in groups upon the floor of the exchange, complained the New York Post, and openly manifest their sympathy with the rebels. 11 speculation was disloyal, in fact, if not intention, cornering gold in order to force up its price, as Morgan did, was not economic necessity, but speculative malignancy. 69-70. Gold speculation harassed the government in financing THLT. War and was dangerous in its influence on public opinion. Negro emancipation had been decreed by the practical dreamer in the White House. Final victory was assured, but the Emine, Diet, military situation was still agonizingly indefinite. Congress decided to act and in 1864 passed the gold bill to crush gold speculation. At once there was a blast against the bill. It was characterized by a group of bankers, among them J. Pierpont Morgan, as only one more instance of the utter lawlessness of Congress. 16. A meeting was called in New York City for the purpose of urging the repeal or modification of the gold bill, which has paralyzed business and forced honest men either to abandon their business or do what is repugnant to them, resort to expedients to evade the law. 17. Among the group calling the meeting, of which Morgan was secretary, were some of the most active and hardened gold speculators. Their inflammatory sentiments were not shared generally by the business community, however, and they were rebuked by most of the participants in the discussion. S.B. Chittenden denied that Congress had interfered with legitimate business and urged every loyal banker and merchant to submit unmurmuringly for a time to all the inconveniences until the bill could be carefully amended or modified. Most of the private and state bankers opposing the gold bill were also opposed to the National Bank Act. It was an opportunity to strike the enemy. Far from taking the back track, said John Thompson of the First National Bank, Congress will compel Wall Street to use the government currency and show the gold speculators that there is a power in the land superior to their machinations. The meeting adopted the compromise of a committee to discuss modifying the bill with Secretary Chase a one, but Congress did take the back track. It had to. The gold bill was a loose measure utterly unable to accomplish its purpose. The House of Morgan, speculating in gold, pose. Legitimate and speculative transactions in gold were not clearly separated. And the closing of the gold room produced bootleg speculation, which shot the price of gold up to 198 and then 250. Speculation could not be suppressed simply by making it illegal, since it was inherent in the prevailing organization of industry and finance. The suppression of speculation involved a whole series of measures in terms of the social control of business for which neither Congress nor the nation was prepared. Speculation proceeded in spite of its illegality. The bulls, among them Ketchum, Son and Company, virtually cornered gold and forced the price up. Business was being demoralized, protests multiplied, and within 2 weeks, a frightened Congress repealed the gold bill. Then a clique of bulls who had cornered gold forced the price up to 285 and plundered legitimate business of more millions. 18. The Ketchums, particularly Edward, continued bulling gold. The profits were still good. But in 1865, the approaching final victory of the Union produced a decline in the price of gold. Edward Ketchum persisted in bulling gold, however, and his large speculative profits melted away. In desperation, he stole $2,800,000 in funds and securities from his father's firm and forged $2,500, 0,000 of gold checks which he put in circulation as collateral for loans. The price of gold now definitely downward, the stolen millions went the way of the others, and Ketchum was arrested after absconding. Revelation of this enterprising speculator's swindles produced many failures, Ketchum, Son and Company, crashing into bankruptcy. Edward Ketchum, formerly considered, while successful, a model young man, discreet, just sober, was now branded the greatest defaulter of the age. 28. In this swindle, Morgan was mulcted out of $85,000, about equal to a share of the profits from the Morgan Ketchum gold speculation of 1863. Among the 11 indictments against Edward Ketchum were 2 sworn by Morgan's firm involving 17 forged gold checks and a Morgan employee testee. 71. The House of Morgan fled the trial. 21. In spite of efforts to screen the swindler, Ketchum was convicted and sentenced to 4 years and 6 months imprisonment. 22. The speculative market in gold was broken, and speculation no longer flourished on the agony of military struggle. It turned to other channels. In Morgan's activity during the Civil War, one fact emerges clearly. He manifested little, if any, of the solidity and force of later years. Financing the scandalous carbine sale and speculating in gold constituted essentially small-time stuff. The petty moneymaker was to become the master of money, to whom money meant power, the mastery over men and things, but there was at the time scarcely any indication of the coming transformation. His aptitudes matured slowly, accretively, and his arrogant, antagonistic personality, together with the lack of brilliance, prevented rapid progress. After being elected to the board of directors of a corporation by his father's influence, Morgan was Gendy but ingloriously dropped because the other directors considered him dull. All his associates got out of him at board meetings was yes or no on roll calls, and they objected to dummy directors. 22, neither dull nor dummy, Morgan's aptitudes matured slowly, while he had another and probably more important characteristic. Morgan was uncomfortable among equals and repressed among superiors, his impulse being to issue orders and rule, an impulse which simply creates antagonism and enmity where it cannot compel obedience. Ideas and decisions formed in his mind, silently, issuing his orders and not as contributions to discussion. Unfit to be one among many, Morgan was driven to being one over many. This is the quality of dictatorship and usually disadvantageous, unless offset by brilliance or an ingratiating nature, until the moment of dictatorship comes. Morgan's rise was necessarily slow, in which the power and prestige of his father's firm largely offset temperamental defects until these merged in the sacrosanctity of power. But the arrogant, silent financial fledgling made progress, speculating in gold, surely, if slowly. In 1864, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company became Dabney Morgan and Company, marking a distinct upward movement in Morgan's development too. Charles H. Dabney had been a partner in Duncan, Sherman and Company, where Morgan formerly worked as a clerk. The firm's importance, which decided Dabney in his choice of partner, lay in being the American representatives of J.S. Morgan and Company. The new style of Peabody and Company since 1864, George Peabody retiring. Dabney contributed much in experience and affiliations. Morgan moved upward by acquiring and discarding partners. In the 7 years of the partnership, Dabney, Morgan and Company accumulated profits of G0,000,000, an excellent showing, all things considered. 25. More decisive, it meant an accumulation of power indispensable to the development of J. Pierpont Morgan's personality. 73. Chapter the 8th. Economic and Political Changes. Dear dearie ro queer everything is today. I wonder if I've changed during LA. Night. Let me think. Was I the salmon I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? AFC, that's the great puzzle. Alice in Wonderland. The British branch of the House of Morgan during the Y was limited to general European business, foreign exchange, and particularly the resale of American securities on abroad. Believing in Confederate victory, European investor almost completely disposed of their American holdings. It was not until 1864, upon definite assurance of Union victory, that foreign capital again began to flow into the United States, most of the resales of American security. Were through Peabody, Cinco, who dominated the field. The firm was in difficult position, sentiment in British ruling circles favoring the Confederacy of manufacturers resenting the scarcity of cotton, although liberals and popular feeling were with the Union. In spite of severe unemployment and distress caused by the war, the textile workers of Manchester sent an address to the American president expressing their solidarity. To which Abraham Lincoln replied that their action was an instinct of sublime Christian heroism, which has not been surpassed in any age or country. One Peabody and Company apparently trimmed their sails to opinion in ruling British circles, arousing considerable American criticism. In 1866, the New York Post essayed, "What was Mr. Peabody doing? He was making money economic political changes. The war. He was watching the ups and downs of the money market, the fluctuations of public credit, and was piling up his profits. In a time of war, especially such a terrible war as we were engaged in, a war in which the greatest interests, commercially speaking, are subject to great and sudden changes. A shrewd dealer in public securities has vast advantages. Mr. Peabody added largely to his princely fortune in this manner." This criticism was amplified by the Springfield Republican, which insisted that George Peabody and Junius Morgan gave us no faith and no help in our struggle for national existence. Through no house were so many American securities sent home for sale as by them. No individuals contributed so much to flooding the money markets with the evidences of our debts to Europe and breaking down their prices and weakening financial confidence in our nationality. And none made more money by the operation. 2. Answers in the New York Times insisted the charges were cruelly unjust, and that Peabody and Morgan simply did what we all did, making money in the war. Adding, they could not refuse to send home the securities of their correspondents. Such indeed was the distrust at home that many of our capitalists sent their money abroad for safekeeping. Speculation and profits are legitimate in terms of business morality, yet they may be objectively disloyal. Business identifies itself with a nation, but the two are not synonymous. They may clash under certain conditions, particularly as there are divergent social groups in the nation. George Peabody denied the charge of disloyalty in an address in 1868, just before his death. I wish publicly to avow that, during the terrible contest through which the nation has passed, my sympathies were still and always will be with the Union, that my uniform course tended to assist, but never to injure. The credit of the government of the Union? The sincerity of Peabody's disclaimer is unquestionable. Lib. 75. T6, the House of Morgan. Earl and humanitarian George Peabody appreciated the progressive issues involved in the Civil War, and his approval of emancipation is proven by the gift of $3,500,000 to promote Negro education. Moreover, Peabody was old, inactive, and retired during the war, the firm becoming J.S. Morgan and Company while favoring the Union. Junius Morgan was swayed neither by liberal nor humanitarian impulses, calculatingly businesslike. Business transcends national ideals. The House of Morgan could not refuse to send home the securities of correspondents. Banking is banking, and business is business. The unemployed, hungry textile workers of Manchester might tighten their belts and send resolutions of sympathy to Abraham Lincoln, but a banking house must serve its clients, maintain its credit, or crash. In 1917, the then master of the House of Morgan, J. Pierpont Morgan, Jr., expressed the readiness to be commandeered by the government and said, "We will do anything that is right, honorable, and not to the injury of our credit. In the choice between credit and the national interest, credit comes first." Junius Morgan was simply carrying on business as usual and making money. Money making is as legitimate in war as in peace. During the war, Junius Morgan's sustained interest in American developments was curiously illustrated by his connection with the importation of indentured labor into the United States. Labor and frontiersmen had waged an unrelenting struggle against the seizure of the public lands by capitalist speculators and Slavocrats, insisting on their free use by the people. Congress recognized the importance of this issue in 1862 by passage of the Homestead Act, opening the western lands to free settlement. Manufacturers had always opposed free land, fearful it would draw workers to the West, create labor scarcity, make the workers independent, and increase wages. They combined with speculators to circumvent the Homestead Act. One means was the grant of millions of acres of public lands to speculators through fraudulent entry, and economic political changes 77. Other millions to railroad corporations. Another was the Immigration Act of 1864, authorizing the importation of foreign labor under conditions amounting to indentured servitude and the grant of lands to corporations engaged in the business of importing labor. One of these corporations was the American Emigrant Company, acting as the direct agent of employers by means of a system of indentured labor. Among its sponsors were J.S. Morgan and Company. The American Emigrant Company was investigated by the Canadian Ministry of Agriculture. The report of 1865 emphasizing the company's very considerable profits and giving the sources. Fees from all applicants, graded charges to emigrants who were shipped to the United States, commissions on tickets from ships and railroads. Taking the emigrants' fare in gold and paying same American paper currency loans to emigrants on pledge of wages. And participation in the profits of speculative land companies' American labor opposed the emigrant companies, declaring they constituted a direct attempt to control the price of home labor. But not until 20 years later did Congress initiate legislation against contract labor. There was no particular importance in Junius Morgan's sponsorship of the American Emigrant Company. He received none of the profits, apparently, except as indicating the drift of class forces. The Immigration Act of 1864 was an expression of aggressive capitalism, the power of which was consolidated by the Civil War, objectively waged to ensure the supremacy of the industrial and financial interests of the North. Profiteering, speculation, and corruption flourished during the war, but they were simply scum on the surface of fundamental economic and political changes. Slavocracy was crushing at the same time the agrarian democracy of Jefferson and Jackson. Economic mastery moved from farm to factory, from the country to the city, climaxing pre-war developments. Within 30 years, capitalist enterprise converted the United. 78, the House of Morgan, states into the mightiest of industrial nations, in the midst of which the House of Morgan conquered supreme power in industry and finance. Business prospered during the Civil War, failures almost disappearing. By increasing prices, the depreciated paper currency lowered the workers' real wages and the farmers' income while favoring business profits. Wealth concentrated among manufacturers, merchants, financiers, and speculators, producing a large accumulation of investment capital available for new business enterprises. The war, moreover, accelerated industrial development. Inventions and technological improvements multiplied, plants becoming larger and more efficient. Iron and steel manufacturers, the basis of modern industry, developed swiftly under pressure of the war's requirements for munitions. And after the war, the expanded metallurgical industry increased its production of peace goods. The heavy demands upon war industries compelled more efficiency, larger plants, and consolidation of scattered plants, a development emphasized by the general growth in standardization, quantity production, and corporate enterprise. Petty industry was yielding to large-scale industry. Corporations combined in order to fix prices, evade taxation, and profit from speculative opportunities, including large promoters' profits. Industry emerged from the Civil War larger, more efficient, protected by higher tariff rate, and with an immense amount of investment capital for new enterprises, while consolidation and combination began their conquest of American business. Although in control of the national government, triumphant industrialism politically was still insecure. In terms of all Americans, the Republican Party was a minority party and would have been swept out of the government had Northern and Southern Democrats been allowed to unite. But the Republican Party, by military force and under cover of Negro liberation, disfranchised the South, smashed political opposite. Junius Spencer Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, economic political changes, shown as industrialists and financiers, smashed economic opposition and consolidated capitalist control of the national government. The implacable measures of Reconstruction, originally conceived by Thaddeus Stevens and others primarily and in all sincerity to ensure the Negro's rights, were soon transformed into a struggle of triumphant. Unscrupulous capitalism to retain control of government, a struggle directed equally against northern labor, agriculture, and the middle class. Once this capitalist control was accomplished, the Republican Party shamelessly deserted the Negro. The South was the anvil upon which capitalism forged its political power, violently, often illegally, and always ruthlessly, Reconstruction being the Civil War in other forms. It was during the 10 years of Reconstruction, when the Republican Party maintained itself in power largely by military force and corruption, that politics itself became a business, the source of many a fortune. National and state governments showered favors lavishly upon industrialists, financiers, and speculators, nor was this aid the result of a definite social policy to encourage business enterprise, but usually corrupt favors secured by one set of businessmen at the expense of other businessmen and society. The tariff, determined almost exclusively by the interests of particular manufacturers and not industry in general, was a source of much corruption. Most railroad legislation was secured by corrupt practices, and the Northern Pacific Railroad was stigmatized as a gang of plunderers. By 1872, Congress had granted 150 million acres of public lands and millions in money to railroads, nearly all of which went to enrich speculators. 10. When investigations revealed corruption and plundering, nobody was punished. Chicanery in politics expressed chicanery in business. The dominant mood of the nation was itself corrupt. Get rich was the universal cry, and becoming rich legitimized the means, whether fair or foul, in the pulpit of. 79. 80. The House of Morgan. God Henry Ward Beecher preached variations on the theme, "It is good to get rich." Money was the holy water of life. The finer aspects of Puritanism, expressed in pre-war humanitarian movements and culture, were crushed. The more ignoble aspects, identifying godliness and acquisition, survived, and conquered. Amassing riches, regardless of the means, was justified by riches and by the old philosophy of the Reverend Joseph Morgan, each man coveting to make himself rich. Carries on the public good. Thus God in his wisdom and mercy turns our wickedness to public benefit. There was an illuminating secular expression of this curious philosophy of riches at a testimonial dinner to Junius Morgan in 1877, given in his honor for upholding American credit and honor in Europe when disasters have swept over our enterprises and the public faith has been exposed to reproach. Among those present were prominent bankers, manufacturers, merchants, railroad men, and speculators, including John Jacob Astor and Theodore Roosevelt the Elder, representing aggregate wealth of $1 billion. Samuel J. Tilden, the chairman, said in his introductory remarks, "The men I see before me are owners and managers of colossal capitals. You are doubtless in some degree clinging to the illusion that you are working for yourselves, but it is my pleasure to claim that you are working for the public." Applause. While you are scheming for your own selfish ends, there is an overruling and wise providence directing that the most of all you do should inure to the benefit of the people. Men of colossal fortunes are in effect, if not in fact, trustees for the public. It was a comforting and inspiring philosophy, sanctifying not only riches, but the means used to acquire riches. The exploitation of men, women, and children, the violent crushing of competitors, fraud, thievery, and corruption, they were all justified if they made one rich, since becoming rich meant. Economic.political, changes 81. Working for the public. Acquisitive and predatory impulses were universal. People were all brothers under their skins, big buccaneers being the concentrated expression of millions of little buccaneers all trying to get rich in exactly the same way. The feverish years after the Civil War were economically and politically an age of buccaneering and of unprecedented economic civil war. It was an almost unbelievably fantastic amalgam of ruthless speculation, savage competition, political and business corruption, and of illegality cynically manipulating law in its predatory operations. Business buccaneers swooped upon and seized the nation's resources and industry, plundered each other and society. Corporation clashed against corporation in the onward sweep of consolidation and combination. War was waged upon natural resources, against labor and the farmers, upon government. Often it was physical war, more often it was the war of intrigue, corporate manipulation, intimidating and crushing competitors, stock jugglery and corruption. Always the economic civil war was unscrupulous. The buccaneers corrupted legislators, judges, and newspapers, and often businessmen were blackmailed by political threats. "If I had my way," said one politician, "I would put the manufacturers over the fire and fry all the fat out of them." While in this buccaneer age, unscrupulous weaklings and scrupulous strong men were equally beaten down. But beneath all the buccaneering, exploitation, and shameless corruption, there were irresistible constructive forces. And it was by levying tribute upon these constructive forces that the buccaneers acquired their fortunes and power. Industry and agriculture were transformed by more efficient machinery, multiplying the production of goods, developing the new economic system of large-scale production, of concentrated capitalism. A decisive aspect of this development was the increasing dependence of industry upon finance, the masters of money becoming the masters of industry. As industry assumed larger dimensions and functioned through an increasingly complex. 82. The House of Morgan. Network of corporate and financial relationships, finance created an institutionalized technique for the regulation and control of industry. It was by means of this technique, expressing important economic changes, that the House of Morgan conquered power.